I have spent decades mapping the rise and fall of reserve currencies, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that what we are witnessing right now is not a temporary disruption or a policy mistake that can be corrected. We are watching the mechanical unwinding of a system that took 70 years to build and will take far less time to dismantle. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is not ending because of a single event or a dramatic crisis. It is ending because the conditions that created its dominance have reversed and the incentives that once supported it have fundamentally changed. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition based on 5 centuries of monetary history. Every reserve currency that has ever existed has followed the same trajectory. Ascension through productivity and military strength, dominance through network effects and trust, and decline through fiscal excess and competitive erosion. The Venetian ducat, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, all of them believed their position was permanent until the moment it wasn't. The United States dollar is now in the late stages of this cycle, and 2026 represents the point where the decline becomes impossible to ignore, even by those who have every incentive to deny it. When I look at the global financial system today, I see a structure held together not by strength, but by the absence of alternatives. That is a very different kind of stability. For decades, the dollar dominated because it was the best option in a world where trade needed a universal medium of exchange. Countries accumulated dollars not because they loved American policy, but because dollars were liquid, stable, and backed by the deepest capital markets in the world. That network effect created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more countries used dollars, the more valuable dollars became, which made even more countries want to use them. But network effects work in both directions. Once confidence begins to erode, the same mechanism that built dominance accelerates decline. A reserve currency does not lose its status gradually and predictably. It loses it suddenly, after years of quiet erosion that most observers dismiss as temporary noise. The foundation weakens invisibly until a relatively minor shock exposes the fragility underneath. We are now in that phase of invisible weakening, and the structural cracks are becoming too large to ignore. The mechanics of this process are not mysterious. They are mathematical. A reserve currency requires 3 foundational pillars: fiscal discipline, political stability, and economic dynamism. When these pillars weaken simultaneously, the currency's credibility erodes regardless of short-term policy interventions. Right now, the United States is experiencing stress in all 3 areas at once, and the pressure is building in ways that cannot be resolved through monetary policy alone. Start with fiscal discipline. The United States national debt now exceeds $35 trillion, and it is growing faster than the economy that supports it. This is not a partisan observation. It is arithmetic. Debt to GDP has crossed 130%, a level historically associated with crisis and default in other nations. The critical difference is that most countries cannot print the currency their debt is denominated in. The United States can, which delays the reckoning but does not eliminate it. Instead of default, the path chosen is debasement, which transfers the cost from creditors to currency holders. Interest payments on this debt now consume over $1 trillion annually, more than the defense budget. As rates rise, this burden grows automatically, creating a fiscal trap. The government must borrow more just to pay interest on what it already owes, even before funding any new programs or responding to any crisis. This dynamic is self-reinforcing. Higher debt requires more borrowing, which increases interest costs, which requires even more borrowing. There are only 2 ways out: austerity or inflation. History shows that democracies almost never choose austerity when inflation is available. The Federal Reserve is trapped between 2 impossible choices. If it keeps rates low to make debt affordable, inflation accelerates and the dollar's purchasing power declines. If it raises rates to control inflation, the fiscal burden becomes unsustainable and recession risk increases. There is no neutral path. Every decision trades one form of instability for another. This is what a late-stage debt cycle looks like. The room for error shrinks and the cost of mistakes compounds. Now, layer in political instability. A reserve currency depends on predictable, credible institutions. Investors around the world hold dollars because they trust that the United States will honor its obligations and maintain a relatively stable policy environment. That trust is not infinite. It is earned through decades of consistent behavior, and it can be lost much faster than it was built. When I look at American politics today, I see a system that is increasingly unable to make difficult long-term decisions because short-term incentives overwhelm everything else. Polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War era. The political center has collapsed. Compromise is treated as betrayal. This is not just about partisan disagreement. It is about the inability of the system to function under stress. When a country cannot pass a budget without repeated crises, when debt ceiling negotiations become existential threats every few years, when allies cannot predict whether agreements will be honored after the next election, the perception of stability dissolves. Foreign governments are not blind to this. They watch American political dysfunction and they adjust their strategies accordingly. If you cannot rely on policy continuity, you reduce your exposure. If you cannot trust that sanctions will be applied consistently, you build alternative systems. If you see a country struggling to govern itself, you prepare for a world where its dominance is no longer guaranteed. This is not hostility. It is rational risk management. Economic dynamism is the third pillar, and here the picture is more complex. The United States still leads in technology, innovation, and higher education. Its capital markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world, but leadership is relative, and the gap is narrowing. China now graduates more engineers annually than the United States. It leads in electric vehicles, solar production, and several critical technology sectors. Its infrastructure investment dwarfs what the United States allocates. These are not opinions, they are measurable facts. The question is not whether America remains strong. It is whether it remains strong enough relative to competitors to sustain the extraordinary privilege of reserve currency status. That privilege allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits without immediate consequences, to borrow in its own currency at lower rates than economic fundamentals would otherwise allow, and to weaponize financial access in ways no other country can. These advantages are worth trillions of dollars over time, but they are not permanent. They depend on the rest of the world continuing to accept the arrangement. What I observe now is a shift in incentives. Countries that once had no choice but to participate in a dollar-centric system are now building alternatives, not because they have defeated the United States militarily or economically, but because the costs of dependence have started to outweigh the benefits. Sanctions have become a routine tool of foreign policy, which teaches other nations that dollar dependence is a vulnerability. Freezing Russian reserves after the Ukraine invasion sent a clear signal to every other country. Your assets are only safe as long as your policies align with Washington. That is not a stable foundation for a global reserve currency. The response has been predictable. China and Russia now settle significant portions of their trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is negotiating oil sales in currencies other than dollars. Central banks are diversifying reserves away from dollar-heavy allocations and into gold, other currencies, and alternative assets. None of these moves individually threatens dollar dominance, but collectively, they represent a slow unwinding of the network effect that created dollar supremacy in the first place. This is where 2026 becomes critical. We are approaching a convergence of pressures that will make the underlying instability impossible to ignore. The United States will face a presidential transition or a second-term administration with limited political capital. Debt will continue growing faster than GDP. Fiscal pressures from entitlement spending will intensify as the baby boom generation fully enters retirement. Geopolitical competition with China will escalate, forcing expensive commitments in defense and technology, and global central banks will continue reducing their dependence on dollar reserves as a matter of strategic necessity. None of these trends require a crisis to continue. They are already in motion. The question is not whether stress will increase, but whether the system can absorb it. History suggests it cannot. When a reserve currency loses credibility, the process accelerates non-linearly. Confidence is binary. It exists or it doesn't. Once major players begin to question the durability of the system, behavior changes rapidly. Capital flows reverse. Alternatives gain legitimacy. What seemed impossible becomes inevitable. I am not predicting hyperinflation or immediate collapse. The dollar will not disappear, but its role will change, and that change will be profoundly disruptive. A transition from unipolar monetary dominance to a multipolar currency system creates volatility, uncertainty, and repricing of assets on a global scale. Investors who assume the old rules still apply will find themselves on the wrong side of a historic shift. The parallel that concerns me most is the British pound between 1914 and 1971. Britain entered World War I as the dominant financial power. The pound was the world's reserve currency, backed by the largest empire in history. But the war imposed costs that could not be sustained. Debt exploded. Competitors grew stronger. The network effect began to erode. By 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement formally transferred monetary leadership to the United States. The pound did not collapse overnight. It declined over decades through crisis after crisis until its reserve status was finally gone. The United States today is not Britain in 1914, but the mechanics are similar. Overextension, rising debt, relative economic decline, and the emergence of a competitor with different structural advantages. China does not need to surpass the United States in every metric. It only needs to create enough doubt about American sustainability to fracture the consensus that keeps the dollar system intact. What makes this moment different from previous periods of dollar stress is the absence of external support. In the 1980s, when the dollar faced pressure, Japan and Europe had strong incentives to support it because their security depended on American stability. Today, those incentives are weaker. Europe is economically stagnant and politically divided. Japan faces its own demographic and fiscal crisis. China has no interest in propping up a system that constrains its rise. The coalition that stabilized the dollar in past crises no longer exists in the same form. This is why I view 2026 as a point of no return. Not because something specific will happen on a particular date, but because the cumulative weight of these trends will reach a threshold where reversal becomes structurally impossible. Once reserve currency status begins to erode in earnest, the feedback loops work against you. Higher borrowing costs make debt harder to service. Reduced demand for your currency weakens your ability to run deficits. Loss of financial privilege forces painful adjustments that create political instability, which further undermines confidence. The most dangerous assumption people make is that this process will be managed smoothly by competent technocrats who understand the stakes. History offers no support for that assumption. Monetary transitions are chaotic because the interests involved are enormous and the room for error is small. Policy mistakes compound. Markets overshoot. Political systems struggle to adapt because the old playbook no longer works and the new one has not been written yet. For individuals and institutions, the implications are clear. A world where the dollar is no longer the unquestioned reserve currency is a world where everything gets repriced. Assets that depend on dollar stability will face pressure. Alternatives that were once marginal will gain legitimacy. Geographic diversification will matter more than it has in decades. The assumption that American assets are the safest default option will be tested in ways that challenge conventional wisdom. I am not saying abandon all dollar exposure or flee to bunkers. I am saying recognize where we are in the cycle. Understand that what worked for the past 70 years may not work for the next 20. Position accordingly. Maintain flexibility. Avoid concentration in assets that depend on the continuation of a system that is already fracturing. The dollar's decline is not a prediction. It is a process already underway. The only question is whether you see it in time to adapt or whether you wait until the shift is so obvious that positioning has already become expensive. History teaches that those who move early are criticized as alarmist. Those who move late are simply casualties. The window between those two states is narrower than most people assume, and 2026 is when that window begins to close.